Gangs in Chicago are angry over the influx of migrants and criminals in their city and warn that turf wars between Chicago's gangs and groups like Venezuela's Tren de Aragua could see Chicago, quote, go up in flames.
America has allowed gangs to enter our country.
The migrants that are coming, they're taking over every block right now.
When the black gangs, the leadership in the black gangs in Chicago get fed up, the city of Chicago is gonna go up in smoke, it's gonna go up in flame, and there's gonna be nothing that the National Guard or our government can do about it.
Cartels are known for being extremely dangerous and ruthless, which naturally makes them feared by many. But what happens when these cartels choose the wrong city to settle in? One where not everyone is afraid of them.
And there's gonna be nothing that the National Guard or our government can do about it when the bloodshed hit the streets.
Cartels are definitely among the most feared criminal organizations out there. With their power, resources, and military-style training, it's no wonder people assume they could easily crush any neighborhood or gang that stands in their way. And honestly, that assumption isn't far from the truth. But then, there's one group that couldn't care less about the cartel's reputation: the Chicago gangs.
A lot of people just resort to violence. Like I say, it would be a shootout in Chicago over the smallest stuff. Chips, dice games, just the smallest stuff.
Like, to be honest with you, even standing out here right now is not safe, period. None of these blocks or none of these streets are safe.
Right now, because of them, there's an all-out war brewing between some of Chicago's toughest gangs and new cartel forces moving into what's notoriously known as Emder City, or Chirac. Here's the thing.
America has allowed gangs to enter our country. Gangs that they would consider ex-terrorist groups.
Chicago gangs have always been highly organized. They don't tolerate nonsense, especially from outsiders, and they've been running their neighborhoods with their own strict code and structure for decades. So when these new cartels tried to set up shop in Chicago, they weren't just met with resistance, they walked straight into chaos.
And warns that the city may go up in flames, fearing an all-out turf war.
One group stirring up a lot of trouble is a Venezuelan prison gang called Tren de Aragua. This gang started within the prison system in Venezuela and has now crossed over into the U.S., raising alarm bells, especially in cities like Chicago.
Members of a violent Venezuelan gang have made their way into the U.S. and here to Chicago. Authorities confirmed to NBC News that they are investigating.
Gangs in Chicago are angry over the influx of migrants and criminals in their city and warn that turf wars between Chicago's gangs and groups like Venezuela's Tren de Aragua could see Chicago, quote, go up in flames.
Tren de Aragua evolved from just a prison gang into a massive transnational criminal organization. With over 5,000 members, it's Venezuela's largest criminal group involved in STFing, drug smuggling, and human trafficking. This gang has been linked to some high-profile crimes across the U.S., including in cities like New York, Denver, and Chicago.
They've also been fielding questions about the emergence of Tren de Aragua. It's the largest criminal organization in Venezuela with more than 5,000 members.
The fact that they're popping up in sanctuary cities like Chicago has local law enforcement on edge. Emails obtained by News Nation from the Cook County Sheriff's Office showed that warnings about this gang's presence in the Chicago area started circulating as early as October last year. The Tren de Aragua is described as a new threat developing amongst the newly arriving immigrant community. With its roots deep in human trafficking in Latin America, the gang is suspected of bringing that same criminal activity to U.S. soil, including and labor trafficking. In one email, officials at the sheriff's office admitted they had been discussing the possibility of a criminal network operating within Chicago's migrant community and preying on vulnerable new arrivals. One email bluntly stated, "It appears we have confirmation of that now." Chicago isn't the only place feeling their impact, though. Law enforcement agencies in cities like New York City and Denver have also reported sightings of Tren de Aragua's members.
Suspect identified as a Venezuelan migrant, accused of shooting two officers after they tried to pull him over for driving the wrong way.
In Colorado, they've already made their presence known by taking over apartment complexes and intimidating entire neighborhoods.
It's scenes coming out of a movie as the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua are seen breaking into apartment complexes in Aurora, Colorado. There you can see the group well armed and forcing an apartment door open and making their way in. This has raised concerns amongst residents.
But while places like New York and Denver are dealing with the effects of this gang's rise, Chicago is in a league of its own when it comes to standing up to them. Unlike in other cities, Chicago's gangs aren't just sitting back and letting Tren de Aragua take over. They're going head-to-head with these guys, and the tension between them is only ramping up. Muhammad, a 53-year-old former gang member who now leads a street patrol and violence prevention program called Ex-Cons for Community and Social Change, has spoken out about this situation. He says that seeing Venezuelan criminal gangs infiltrating local shelters and taking over apartment buildings is the final straw for Chicago's African-American community, which has long struggled with poverty and violence. Muhammad and many others in the community are furious about what they see as government money being funneled toward non-citizens. He said, "It's impossible to let gang members and criminals flood into our country through broken borders and drop them into our communities, which are already struggling."
It is impossible to release gang members and criminals into our country through the borders and broken walls.
Speaking from the O Block, one of the most dangerous parts of the city, Muhammad warned, when the black gangs here get fed up with the illegalities and criminal activities of these migrants, the city of Chicago is going to explode. And when the bloodshed hits the streets, there's nothing the National Guard or the government can do to stop it. It'll be blacks versus migrants.
Then the black gangs in Chicago get fed up with the illegalities and the criminal activity of these migrants, and there's gonna be nothing that the National Guard or our government can do about it when the bloodshed hit the streets.
The numbers back up the frustration. Chicago has spent nearly $500 million over the past 2 years dealing with the influx of more than 42,000 migrants since 2022. These migrants have been given money for rent, food stamps, and even cars. In some cases, local African Americans have been pushed out of their homes because landlords can make more money housing migrants, thanks to government assistance. Some of these migrants belong to Tren de Aragua, the once Venezuelan prison gang that's now operating as a multinational crime syndicate. Sources in Chicago have told reporters that members of this gang are heavily armed, brazen, and spilling into parts of the South Side traditionally controlled by Chicago's deeply rooted gangs, such as the Gangster Disciples, Black Pistones, Vice Lords, Latin Kings, and Satan Disciples. You can even see Tren de Aragua members out on the streets, often wearing Chicago Bulls t-shirts and hats, flashing gang signs as they try to muscle in on local gangs' territories. One specific incident occurred near a 7-Eleven store close to the Standard Club migrant shelter downtown, where local Chicago police officers said the Venezuelan gang was attempting to take over a drug-dealing corner. Despite this, employees at the Standard Club deny that there's been any crime or Venezuelan gang presence at the shelter, but that doesn't align with what activists have found. Terry Newsom, a Chicago dad-turned-activist, teamed up with Muhammad and other concerned community members to dig deeper into what's really going on. Newsom found that there were 720 police incident reports filed at the Standard Club alone over the past year, contradicting claims that the area is free from crime. In an effort to expose the truth, Newsom and his team have been filing dozens of Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests, trying to get to the bottom of what's really happening with the migrant crime surge and the infiltration of Tren de Aragua. Terry Newsom, an activist, showed the Post police reports revealing disturbing criminal activities at downtown shelters housing migrants. We're talking about serious stuff: STFing, child drugs, carjackings, weapons, and spouse. In one case, a TDA member was even released by a Chicago judge despite Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) requesting he be detained. Just a month later, that same gang member was charged in a violent jewelry store heist in Denver, not far from Aurora, Colorado, where TDA members have reportedly taken over entire apartment buildings. Things are getting even more intense on the streets of Chicago. Earlier this month, Chicago police responded to a call about 32 armed Venezuelan migrants showing off their weapons in a building on the south side. It's no wonder the locals are fed up. Many residents, including the younger generation of gang members, who are sometimes called the millennials by older gangsters, feel completely overlooked by city officials. They're angry that resources are being handed to migrants while their own communities continue to suffer. David, a young Gangster Disciples member, vented his frustration to the Post, saying, "The real issue is that America's letting gangs that they would consider ex-terrorist groups into the country." He added angrily, "They're letting terrorist groups into our country." Zach Massey, a 27-year-old street street leader who recently got out of prison after serving time since 2015, echoed the sentiment. He said, "These migrant gangs are moving in on our territory and robbing people, but they don't get arrested like we do. I talked to one of them through a translator app and he told me how they're getting cars, apartments, EBT cards, all kinds of stuff. We barely get $400 a month and they don't even have social security numbers."
And they're all furious at the estimated $500 million that's reportedly been funneled toward new migrants in Chicago since 2022. Happy either about what they say are Venezuelan criminal gangs that are leaving the shelters and spilling out into the South Side into abandoned buildings.
Corey Rogers, a Black Peastone member, took a reporter on a drive around the area pointing out locations where Venezuelan gangs had been showing the flag, a phrase meaning they were brandishing their guns. He even showed a WhatsApp thread where gang members were threatening to start turf wars with the Venezuelan gangs. Rogers expressed his frustration with the lack of unity among the black gangs, saying, "What bothers me is that the Venezuelans are united. The black gangs are too divided and just take each other down."
The migrants that are coming, they're taking over every block right now in this area. Right now, you don't see them because they come out at night.
Charles Harris, a gang leader and friend of Rogers, added his perspective. He pointed to areas of the Woodlawn neighborhood and explained how, while the violence has calmed down somewhat, the last thing they need is the Venezuelans stirring up more trouble. "It's still violent down here, but it's calmed down a lot compared to the old days. The last thing we need is the Venezuelans," Harris said. Muhammad even formed a group called Ex-Cons for Trump, apparently because he feels the Democrats have been failing inner-city black communities for too long. "It's not really about Trump himself," Muhammad said, "but the Democrats are selling us out." He noted how some wealthier black people might support figures like Kamala Harris, but he doesn't see how she or others are doing anything for the struggling communities on Chicago's South Side. Even Reverend Corey Brooks, a longtime pastor and community leader, feels the frustration. Brooks, who's been running his church and outreach group Project Hood on the infamous O Block for over 20 years, explained that his conservatism came from years of witnessing the failed policies of Democratic leaders. He also highlighted how, despite being a Republican, he's genuinely concerned about the growing presence of Venezuelan gangs in his community.
Some of the values that the conservative Republican Party holds so dear. And so for a lot of people, it's not about the person, it's about the policies that we're fed up with. And
Brooks shared a story of a young Venezuelan migrant who fled his apartment after realizing he was living with gang members. The young man, terrified for his life, spoke to the Post but didn't want to give his name or appear on camera. "If they found out I was talking to anyone, they'd end my family's life with one bullet," he said in Spanish, clearly scared of the violent people he had gotten mixed up with.
To flee the building where he's being housed because a Venezuelan criminal gang took it over. He said if they knew he was talking, they'd end his family's life back in Venezuela with one bullet.
It's not just gang members like Muhammad or Rogers who are fed up, though. Regular folks are feeling neglected too. Octavia Mitchell, who tragically lost her son to gun violence in 2010 and her nephew in 2022, started the Heal Your Heart organization to help others dealing with loss. She's frustrated that while over 400 people have been MD'd in Chicago so far in 2024, the city seems more focused on helping migrants than addressing black-on-black violence. "I can't even reach anyone at City Hall who cares," Mitchell said. "They care about the migrants, but they don't care about us, the people who've been here all our lives. We matter too." The growing tension between Chicago's gangs and the Venezuelan cartels could be a powder keg. People are already saying that if this continues unchecked, it could explode into a deadly conflict because Chicago's gangs don't play. Chicago is one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. But on the South Side, known as the heart of Black America, gang violence has torn communities apart. The situation is so brutal that even the police and the gangs themselves agree it's like urban warfare, spiraling out of control.
A lot of people just resort to violence. Like I say, it would be a shootout in Chicago over the smallest stuff. Chips, dice games, just the smallest stuff.
Like, to be honest with you, even standing out here right now is not safe, period. None of these blocks and none of these streets are safe.
Take, for example, an incident that happened far from Chicago but still reflects the mentality that grows out of that environment. On September 9th, 2023 in Pensacola, Florida, the Escambia County Sheriff's Office released a security video showing 32-year-old Rakeem Stephen Tate making what they called a bad decision turned worse. In the footage, Tate walks into a store, visibly armed, with a gun tucked under his right arm.
The best music! Play yourself. Why you hating and being jealous?
The store clerk, who had already spotted Tate's weapon before he even stepped inside, ran to the back to grab his personal firearm.
What's cracking, bro? What's back? Alright. I see you, bro. I don't mean no harm. I'm just not from around here.
Tate didn't end up robbing the place, but he was charged with openly carrying a prohibited weapon and attempted robbery. The sheriff's office posted the footage on Facebook with the caption, "Not a good time for a robbery," and threw in a jab saying, "You're not in Chicago anymore. You're under arrest." While law enforcement saw it as an attempted robbery, some people believe Tate wasn't there to steal but was instead just paranoid, conditioned by the brutal streets of Chicago. It's not far-fetched to think he might have PTSD from living in a place where violence is a daily occurrence. The streets of Chicago can leave people constantly looking over their shoulder, even when they're miles away from home. That's the thing about Chicago gangs. They don't let up, and they don't forget. Even if an enemy runs to another city or state, these gangs will go to any lengths to find and finish their opposition. That's exactly what happened when 3 Chicago gang members emdered 4 of their rivals in Los Angeles. The victims and the suspects were all from Chicago, but the violence followed them across the country.
3 known Chicago gang members suspected in 4 murders in Southern California are finally captured. The investigation and arrests spanning across multiple states.
In January 2023, the bodies of 3 women were found in the Beverly Crest neighborhood of Los Angeles, not far from Beverly Hills. A man had also been off just before Christmas in 2022. After following leads and gathering witness statements, the LAPD, working with the FBI and police departments in Chicago and New York, arrested the suspects: 28-year-old Derry Stanford, 22-year-old Dontai Williams, and 28-year-old Dejon Tompkins. 2 were arrested in Chicago and Indiana, while the 3rd was caught in Manhattan.
To the 3 women who were murdered and a man who was shot and killed in North Hollywood last December. The victims and the suspects are all from Chicago.
Stanford and Williams were charged with 3 counts of emder and 6 counts of attempted emder. Tompkins was also charged with 4 counts and linked to the December 2022 emder of Julian Bynum in North Hollywood. The 3 women who were offed, 29-year-old Nina Davis, 26-year-old Destiny Sims, and 33-year-old Yana Hutton, were not the gang's intended targets, according to the police. The women had rented an Airbnb to follow a Chicago-based rapper and were emdered right in front of the house they were staying in. Although the police didn't give details on why these Chicago gang members traveled all the way to LA to commit these emders, fans speculated it's just another example of how ruthless Chicago gangs can be. Unlike gangs in California, which are often seen as chaotic and leaderless, Chicago gangs are known to be more structured and organized, with a cold, calculated mindset. Melvin Farmer, an OG from the 8 Trey gangster Crips, shed some light on the big differences between the gang cultures in Los Angeles and Chicago. According to him, gangs like the Gangster Disciples, GDs, in Chicago operate under a completely different structure compared to the Crips and Bloods in LA. Farmer explained, "It's a different ballgame. They got a different structure than the Crips and Bloods. You gotta remember, GDs are growth and development. The Vice Lords too. They came up in the 60s, so they have a whole different mentality. They were passing out lunches and doing community stuff. It's a big difference between street gangs and gangs like the Gangster Disciples or the Black Panthers. They had structure, a chain of command. The streets, though, without that structure, they're like a hole without a pimp. They're renegades."
They got a different structure than Crips and Bloods. You got to remember, GDs are growth developments, Vice Lords. They came up during the era of the 60s. So they got a whole different mentality. The Gangster Disciples, the Black Panthers, they had a structure, a chain of command, whereas the streets, just like a without a pimp, they renegades.
That level of organization doesn't just stop on the streets. It carries over into the prison system too. Sammy Horowitz, a Chicago native and former member of a predominantly Latino street gang, spent over 8 years behind bars, and he shared some insight into how gang politics work in prisons between California and Chicago. One of the most notable differences, according to him, is the role race plays. While racial divisions are a huge thing in California prisons, that's not the case in Illinois, he explained. That doesn't exist in Illinois like it does in California. We used to hear about how things were out here, how everything was divided by race, but that's not really a thing in Illinois. I say Chicago because almost everyone who goes to Illinois prisons is from Chicago, with a few exceptions from southern Illinois or more rural areas. But yeah, most inmates are from Chicago. In Illinois, the politics in prison are more about what gang you're aligned with, rather than what race you belong to. Horowitz explained it as being divided into two groups, folks and people. In Chicago, instead of just Bloods and Crips like out in California, you have folks and people. Think of them like umbrellas, and underneath each umbrella, there are different mobs. For African Americans, you've got the gangster disciples and black disciples, which are under the folks umbrella. On the people side, you've got vice lords and four-corner hustlers. Then, when it comes to the Latino gangs, you have Latin folks and Latin people too. On the people side, you've got Latin kings, Latin counts, and saints. On the folks side, you've got gangs like the C-Notes, Maniacs, Spanish Cobras, and Insane Dragons.
I know out here, for example, there's like Bloods and Crips and everything like that. In Chicago, you have folks and people. You have look at them like umbrellas, right? And underneath those umbrellas, you got different mobs. You know, African Americans, for example, you got gangster disciples, black disciples, that's folks. People, you'll have like vice lords, four-corner hustlers, that's people. And then you have Latin folks and Latin people. So for example, Latin people also aligning with the five, you know, the people, you have like Latin kings, Latin counts.
He also pointed out that this gang structure flows into the prison system in Chicago. When you get to prison in Illinois, the first question you get asked is, what you is, or K2S, meaning what gang are you with? If you're not part of an organization, they call you a neutron, which basically means you're neutral. If you get to Cook County Jail or down to prison, they'll ask you who you align with, and you tell them whatever organization you're part of. They'll tell you where your guys are. In the county jail, it's more divided, but in prison, you'll just find your group and blend in. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and we'll catch you in the next video.